What's up, guys? Hello to Footballtalk here. Fantasy football is back, and it's time to help out everybody listening by giving out a few names to target in your upcoming drafts. As I've done for the last couple of years, I went through consensus rankings and put together my own, compared those against each other, and now I'll highlight the names who I believe present the most surplus value, and therefore I'll be targeting in my leagues. All consensus rankings are provided by fantasy pros who collect the data from a bunch of the main platforms and are based on half-PPR scoring formats, which is what I primarily play, and I believe it's the best one personally. I'll try to mention if I like players better for certain leagues, but my brain just works in a way where half-PPR is the baseline, and I'm recording this on August the 10th, so the rankings may be a little bit off from what you see right now. We'll get to the list in a second here, but if you find this information helpful, please just hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't done so yet. I release either a video or an article in written form over to Footballtalk.com every week, all the way throughout the season, and those will contain plenty of meaningful fantasy info as well. Let me quickly just show you how I structured these graphics. So we'll have the player's name with the team and bye week, then the average draft position according to fantasy pros across the industry in terms of overall and positional ranking, and then my overall rankings and positional ranking down below, just as we move along here. But now let's dive in with the first position, and that's the quarterbacks. I rarely start with the quarterback ranked this highly, but the first name up here is Justin Herbert. And I've been a subscriber of the idea of finding those late round gems in fantasy drafts, such as Patrick Mahomes ahead of his first year as a starter, Lamar Jackson for his MVP season, and others. I've had some really nice hits throughout the years, but as somebody who got burned this past season by the combination of Matt Stafford and Tom Brady falling to me in the double-digit rounds, I'm leaning towards addressing the quarterback position earlier in general. And then we need to acknowledge the fact that the difference between the elite guys in fantasy to the middle of the pack is as big as it's ever been. There's several numbers out there that will tell you that. And Herbert right now is one of those final two names among the 7 or 8 guys you consider as part of that tier. Just looking at the numbers, in 3 years with the Chargers, Justin has finished 9th in total fantasy points, despite not playing week 1 as a rookie, then 2nd in 2021, and finally 11th this past season, when he cracked the rib all the way back in week 2. Even without further context about how the offense was structured, or how that injury lingered and affected him throwing the ball all year, if he just had the 48.2 points he's at least added as a runner in each of his first 2 seasons, he would have been the number 5 quarterback in the NFL. So even if somehow you are one of those people listening to certain TV analysts from morning shows who would call Herbert a YouTube quarterback or criticize him for a lack of team success to some degree, rather than looking at how tremendous he's been individually, he's probably underrated for fantasy purposes simply by looking at his track record. And then we actually add context here about not having his excellent young blindside protecting Rashawn Slater for 15.5 weeks, his top 2 wide receivers Mike Williams and Keenan Allen missing 11 combined games, and the fact he literally punted on a couple of plays just because the rib injury bothered him, and there would have to be a lot going wrong again for him to be in similar circumstances. However, there's a lot more to this. There's been plenty of conversation out there about Joe Lombardi's offense and what kind of insane levels they went to in terms of holding back Herbert's ability to push the ball vertically, and how often he was led to check it down, defenses being all over the stuff, or just how plays were designed in the first place. He went from finishing 2nd to only Matt Stafford, with 25 passes of 40 plus yards between 2020 and 21, to just 7 last year, and he was 31st league-wide in intended yards per attempt. That's along with how static the concepts were, and how little yards after the catch they gained because of it. Now you have Kellen Moore coming in to call plays after 4 years in Dallas, where they finished between 4th and 9th in EPA per dropback, in all but one of those, which is when Dak Prescott got hurt a month into the season, who has missed time otherwise too. The way he marries the run and pass game is so much more impressive than what they did under Lombardi, where they lacked diversity in schemes they used in the ground game, and defenses had a beat on when they wanted to take shots off play action from heavier personnel. Mike Williams hopefully is healthy for most of the season as one of the top ball winners down the field. And then you're looking at who they added in the draft. First rounder Quentin Johnston has to fix how he approaches the catch points and take advantage of his size and hops when there is contact, but he has the burst off the ball to run by people, and more importantly, he's one of the scariest dudes when it comes to catching it on the move and what he can do with it at that size. The only Power 5 receiver to average more than Johnston's 8.9 yards after the catch last season was actually his former TCU teammate Darius Davis, who the Chargers also selected in the 4th round and could be a gadget player for them, and Quentin has been a monster in training camp reportedly. So a more well-designed offense altogether, I believe, more firepower among the receiving corps, without putting pressure on Herbert to always make it happen, and more dynamic passing concepts and healthy ribs. All the signs are there for Justin to have his best season yet, and you're actually grabbing him at a value. To get him in the 5th round after you've already filled out your 2 running back and wide receiver slots potentially is a path I'd like to take. He's currently going as quarterback 7, 48th overall, and I have him as QB 5 and 42nd. If you don't want to make that kind of investment into the position, or just miss out on the guys you like in that range, I think the difference between numbers like 9 and 19 isn't very substantial. Then I would personally suggest making the upside pick of Colts rookie quarterback Anthony Richardson, who deservedly is the top-ranked rookie passer, I believe. He may be the least experienced of the 3 guys selected within the top 4, and you're not getting a huge bargain in the final couple of rounds as your current quarterback 17, but I think he can be that name among the guys you get somewhere in the double-digit rounds who can deliver those huge weeks that end up putting you in the playoffs and ultimately winning you your league. Richardson only started 13 games at Florida, with all but one of those coming this past season, when he completed just under 54% of his passes for a little over 2,500 yards and 17 touchdowns versus 9 interceptions, along with 103 carries for 650 yards and 9 more TDs. So the raw numbers are certainly not up there with the 2 guys that went ahead of him in the actual draft, but he ended up sandwiched between those 2 in my real life rankings, and in terms of the hunt for one of the true superstars at the position, you could make a case for him being number 1. I understand why people had some reservations about him coming out of college, but I also kinda don't get it in terms of constantly referring to raw completion percentage, calling him a project, and stuff like that. I always went back to the term inexperienced instead, because there were moments of defenses rotating the coverage or him not quite having calibrated what he can get away with, while mechanically there are things he can still clean up to perfect the way he gets the ball out. However, in terms of the quarterbacky things, you may not be able to fix as quickly, such as keeping your eyes on the field, navigating the pocket, and manipulating or using your eyes to lead conflict defenders the wrong way. There's a lot to like already. That's along with the fact he has an absolute rocket attached to his right shoulder, and literally is the freakiest athlete we've ever seen at the quarterback position, considering he beat several combine records. And that explosiveness doesn't just show up when rushing for 70-yard touchdowns against LSU, but also the ability to create velocity on the ball and take advantage of smaller windows. His receivers didn't help him out a whole lot, even when he put the ball in spots for them where they could make a play on it. He was 10th in the FBS with a pressure to sack conversion rate of just 9.2%, had an insane 38% missed tackle rate forced as a runner, and only 4 of his 14 turnover-worthy plays came over the final 5 weeks according to Pro Football Focus, so he's already taking major strides. And while the real football and fantasy nerds may realize the potential, in particular in basketball formats, he probably comes off the board earlier than where he's currently listed. In many of your home leagues, people may think, I'm not taking this rookie who's inaccurate and a project altogether, and that's where you can capitalize. I absolutely love his fit with new Colts head coach Shane Steichen, who helped Justin Herbert have a monster rookie season through a vertical passing attack with the Chargers in 2020, but then also just helped Jalen Hurts with the run-up for MVP with a much more simplistic approach offensively in Philadelphia, where he took a lot off the quarterback's mental plates and allowed the talent around him to shine, while facilitating a rushing attack that enhanced Hurts' strength as a power runner. Richardson may not be as cerebral as Herbert or as poised as Hurts at this point, but his talent altogether is superior to both of them, I would say, and he was asked to run an offense that lent itself more to the pro game than either one of those guys, who both just received mega contracts. Indy has an interesting collection of skill position guys, with the stars in 12 personnel, all being between 6'4 and 6'7, giving him maybe a little bit more room for error if he's not pinpoint accurate all the time, along with a couple of quick slot options to gain more separation. While it's a really weird situation between Jonathan Taylor and the organization right now, I would expect him to ultimately be on this team, and people forget that this guy led the league in rushing in 2021, it feels like, and the offensive line should return a lot closer to the form it was that year. I think under Steichen, that entire unit could see a massive bump up, and Richardson provides a steady rushing floor, while having the upside that if he's presented with more easier looks in the RPO game, and is allowed to push the ball vertically to those tall targets, he could deliver plenty of big plays through the air as well. After that group of 7 or 8 guys I referenced at the top, he could easily be right there as the next man up. He's currently going as quarterback 17 and 128th overall. I have him 50 spots higher in my overall rankings and as the quarterback 12. Some honorable mentions here are Geno Smith currently going as QB 14, just underrated by the fantasy community and NFL fans altogether, who just label him as a one-year wonder, So much of what he showed last season was sustainable quarterback play, and now they drafted Jackson Smith and Jigba out of Ohio State in the first round as a perfect number 3 in this offense to be a reliable chain mover after they already featured one of the most dangerous deep passing attacks last season. Matt Stafford is going as QB20 right now. Obviously has the injury concerns already baked into his ADP, but you're probably getting him for free on the waiver wire. The Rams defense is made up of a bunch of rookies and undrafted free agents, putting even more pressure on Stafford and company, who have a much more steady O-line in front of him, and his production could look a lot more what it did in Detroit for over a decade, playing from behind and amassing numbers. And Desmond Ridder, who's basically off the board as QB31, a really deep name I just want you to make a mental note on if you're in a 2-quarterback league, because while the Falcons offense will once again be built through the run game, and I did a super detailed video on that about a month ago, there will be opportunities to hit big plays through the air with all those weapons around him, and he provides some rushing upside. That has us moving on to the running backs, however, and the first name up here is David Montgomery. I wrote about Detroit's backfield back in the middle of June when I listed them among the most improved position groups across the NFL, which at first glance, getting well over 2,500 yards and 27 touchdowns from the crew, seems like they delivered appropriately, but I thought those numbers were more so a reflection of the environment they provided those guys with, and there was some meat left on the bone. The Lions' offensive line, when mostly healthy, is tremendous, and offensive coordinator Ben Johnson is one of the most clever run game designers in football, which is why nearly 62% of the rushing yards by that group came before contact. And while Jamal Williams did have by far his best season as a pro, at least his touchdown total was certainly inflated, as 13 of his 17 scores came from 2 yards away or less. Looking at the underlying metrics, Monty has simply been a better player than Williams, or DeAndre Swift for that matter, who the Lions happily traded away for a 2025 4th-round pick from the Eagles. If you take away his rookie season, he's averaged 4.7 yards per touch, despite being part of a Bears offense that never finished above 25th in DVOA in any of his 3 years there. Nearly 52% of his career rushing total has come after contact, and he's quietly gone over 1,000 receiving yards over that stretch, as somebody that may not have the downfield ability that was so appealing with Swift coming out of college, but a consistent generator of positive plays and checkdowns, who has only dropped 9 of 163 career catchable targets. What he has above those guys to try to let move on this offseason is his ability to create individually, thanks to his contact balance and better change of direction skills than people give him credit for. His 138 missed tackles forced since 2020, ranking 6th behind only Nick Chubb, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Dalvin Cook, and Jonathan Taylor. So pretty damn good company, especially considering all of them touched the ball more than Montgomery, playing for better offenses. I get the concerns around Jahmyr Gibbs, who they drafted out of Alabama 12th overall after trading down, because I think he'll be a big part of the offense with his dynamic skills as a space player and underrated ability to make decisions between the tackles as a runner to contribute from multiple avenues. However, looking at his final 2 seasons with Georgia Tech and Alabama respectively, he averaged just over 12 carries per game and only went over 20 twice across those. That's along with Detroit constantly talking about him as an offensive weapon, and the ways they could utilize him moved out of the backfield. So we could see those two guys on the field together quite a bit, and with Gibbs right around 200 pounds, you'd think Monty doesn't only have the clear path to passing down snaps when you want to leave the back in protection, but also the primary goal line option, looking at how they fed Williams down there last season. Therefore, while I loved Gibbs at Bama, I'll prefer Monty straight up, and you can grab him 2.5 rounds later. I think setting his touchdown total at 10 is fairly conservative. Depending on formats, you get some of those dump-offs on check releases when he's on as a pass protector, and he's the more proven rusher who now gets to run behind the best offensive line of his career. Even including his rookie season, he's finished above the RB25 price tag he's currently at all 4 years so far, once again being part of one of the worst offenses in the league, and now top 6 unit in DVOA and EP per play last season, specifically targeted him, paying him $6 million annually over a guy in Jamal Williams that just finished as the RB8 in half-PPR. It just makes no sense to me, and considering the cost of the other guys among that unit, I'd happily grab Monty in the 6th or 7th round to have a piece of this Lions attack. He's currently going as RB25 like I said, 66 overall. I have him up there as RB16 and 41st. The second back I want to mention here is Samaje Perine, now for the Broncos, who was the clear RB2 in Cincinnati last year, and is actually moving on to a worse offense if you go by 2022 numbers. Yet not only should his workload increase, but there's plenty of reason to believe the arrow is pointing up for his new team. Perine is quietly entering year 7 as a pro, and he's only started 3 games since his rookie season, but he's been effective with the touches that he's received as a member of the Bengals, and is coming off a year where he put up 680 yards and 6 touchdowns and 133 opportunities. I'd say he's not as sudden as Joe Mixon for a bigger back, and he doesn't have great long speed, but he has a legit 3-down skill set, and watching the 2 games he stepped in for Mixon last season, there wasn't much of a drop-off to be honest. Against the Titans, the best run defense in the league at that point, and the Chiefs in a fairly high-scoring affair, he combined for 48 touches with 248 yards, and for the full season, 71% of his total came either after contact or after the catch, so his production wasn't necessarily tied to the offense that he was in, as much as people might think. For Perine to be my recommendation, we have some people scratching their heads right now who have listened to me wax poetic about projected starter Javonte Williams in the past, but as somebody who's gotten bitten by trying to take advantage of the injury discount that J.K. Dobbins has come with recently, I would rather be the one staying away from the guy with a multi-ligament injury in his knee and taking his running mate, who doesn't have any medical concerns, should have a substantial role either way, and could end up bringing major surplus value if Javonte isn't quite himself. Especially considering Sean Payton called him as soon as free agency started and locked him up for the next 2 years at $8.5 million, basically telling him he wants him to be the Alvin Kamara for this offense after he had 2 backs touch the ball more than 150 times, 5 straight times from 2016 onwards with the Saints, before making Taysom Hill his number 2 ball carrier basically in his final season there in 2021. Really, the Broncos can't be much worse on that side of the ball than they were last year, whether that's coaching, quarterback play, or injury luck. Of course, it's not this simple because Sean Payton had Drew Brees for almost his entire tenure with the Saints and quality throughout the offense, but just on the surface, only in the final 2 of his 15 years in New Orleans did his offense finish outside the top 10 in total yards, and number 1 in 6 of those, so the cachet is certainly there. And while the quarterback situation is definitely volatile, with Russell Wilson coming off the worst season of his career by far, a lot of the other pieces are in place. Payton immediately put his stamp on the organization with a couple of new starters on the O-line, and Mike McGlinchey and Ben Powers getting paid significant money, who both are better as run blockers, to give them a really strong front 5 in that regard. They've assembled one of my favorite tight end rooms across the league, where I can see them legitimately spend extended stretches in 13 personnel, and added a legit deep threat in Marvin Mims out of Oklahoma, who they traded up in the late 2nd round for. We don't know exactly which run concepts they'll lean into, although I'd expect a fairly varied approach, but even last season when it felt like a miracle if they were able to gain a first down through the air, they were at least average with 4.4 yards per rush. Understanding how this offense is structured and the involvement of the running back position in the pass game, there should be plenty of work for that group. Just look at Austin Eckler leading the position in receptions by a wide margin, and one of Peyton's disciples in Joe Lombardi with the Chargers last year, and we saw a significant shift in Russ's mindset last season with a career-high checkdown rate just over 10%, which was top 5 league-wide. While Javonte is certainly capable of taking a large portion of that workload at NFL feed, Perine was the 3rd down back for Cincinnati these last couple of years, seeing 51 targets this past season alone, and I think bringing him into the building, this is expected to be a significant part of his role in Denver as well. So looking at the much improved coaching staff, with Russ being due for some positive regression, and one of the premier offensive innovators over the last couple of decades, a better looking offensive line, and healthy receiving weapons, that backfield should certainly benefit, especially considering they were slightly below average in terms of run play rate, due to a point differential of minus 72 on the year. Denver's 319 vacated running back carries from 2022 are the 2nd most in the NFL, and even though Javonte could take back the majority of those, I expect this to be much more in the 60 to 40% range. So if Perine is just Latavius Murray from last year, who played 12 of 13 games in Denver, that would make him RB34, which is already higher than where he's going right now. And if Javonte isn't quite ready, or God forbid gets hurt again, you may have a league winner at your hands. He's currently going as RB39 and 106th overall. I personally have 10 spots higher in my positional rankings and 81st overall. And the 3rd running back here is a name that is pretty unknown among general NFL fans, Jerome Ford for the Browns. Obviously, if you can get Nick Chubb in the middle to late 1st round, that's an investment I'd be happy to make, because he may be in position to have his best season yet. We don't have to talk too much about the track record, as the first running back to start his career with 5 straight seasons averaging over 5 yards per carry, only missing 7 of 82 NFL games, and so much more. Now with Kareem Hunt gone, we should see him get a higher backfield share, extended goal line work, and potentially more targets in the pass game, which has been the one holdup for fantasy owners in taking him early, even though he's beat his ADP pretty much every year. With that being said, there's no room for a second player to emerge in place of Hunt, and I believe Ford could be a much bigger contributor than people acknowledge, especially considering the Browns also allowed D'Ernest Johnson to walk in free agency. Demetric Felton only received 5 opportunities over half the season he was active for in 2022, and the only running back they otherwise brought in was John Kelly, who has never been active for more than 4 games in as many seasons as a pro. The sample size for Ford on offense is very limited, only handling 8 carries for 12 yards and not seeing any targets in the pass game as a rookie. However, not only was that second to Nick Chubb last season already among the 3 players I just mentioned still on the roster, but he also handled kick return duties and finished 6th league-wide with an average of 24.1 yards per. So I wouldn't say that the coaching staff didn't trust him, but rather had 3 backs there already who have proven they can produce with full-time workloads even. So what we have to do at this point is look at Ford's track record in college. A former 4-star recruit for Alabama originally, he decided to transfer to Cincinnati due to the loaded backfield he found himself in, but it took until his senior year with the Wildcats to step into the starting role due to having a first-team all-conference back there in front of him as well. However, when he did finally get his opportunity to shine in 2021, he took full advantage, turning 236 touches into well over 1,500 yards and 20 touchdowns. I love this no-nonsense type of running style, the ability to squeeze through tight creases, make those subtle adjustments to his path, the burst to get around the corner when defenses did take care of contain, the contact balance to bounce off arm tackles and glance hits, and the long speed to finish explosive runs in the end zone. The 2 metrics that really stood out about that senior year: 52 missed tackles forced on 215 carries, and in what PFF calls perfectly blocked runs, nobody averaged more than his 11.2 yards per. Along with that, he was a much more reliable pass catcher and protector than the majority of college backs, averaging 10.5 yards per reception. The Browns O-line has been one of the premier units in football, in particular when it comes to the run game for a while now. Over the last 3 years, they've never finished outside the top 8 in either rushing yards or yards per rush. Head coach Kevin Stefanski comes from the Gary Kubiak school of outside zone, which is what they've heavily concentrated on in Cleveland once he got there in 2020. However, as he's grown as a run game designer and taken advantage of 2 all-pro guards with the blocking skills on the move, they've incorporated power and counter a lot more regularly. On top of that, with a longer and heavier center and Ethan Posick being out to the mix this past offseason and promptly extended, we saw them run at defenses a lot more with inside zone or duo. Chubb is clearly a master of navigating those tight spaces, processing defensive information, and helping his line get the blocking set up. Yet I believe there's plenty to like about how Ford projects into that system as well. He may not be as refined conceptually, but his ability to exploit linebackers, leveraging themselves the wrong way momentarily by exploding through the hole or slicing underneath a puller is very intriguing to me. And then there's the fact that Kareem Hunt was Cleveland's primary option on 3rd downs. I thought I saw a skill set that projected very well for that type of role at Cincinnati with Ford, and even if the Browns want to continue to increase the carry total for Chubb, I think it comes in hand with taking even fewer reps in designated passing situations. So on top of getting a certain piece of the pie on early downs, Ford may be on the field for about 20% of offensive snaps via that avenue alone. And as I envision how this offense may continue to evolve, now with Deshaun Watson having a full offseason with the team, I think spreading the formation and going back to him being one of the elite quarterbacks out of empty sets in Houston, Ford will probably see more opportunities to catch the ball rather than being locked in protection, so that alone is easily worth taking him ahead of ADP, and if Chubb was to miss an extended stretch finally, you just hit the jackpot. Ford is currently going as RB56, barely being drafted. I have him as RB44, 132nd overall, as one of my favorite late round targets. Some honorable mentions here: Dameon Pierce for the Texans is currently going as RB22, who I told you all to draft last year when he was going around RB30, and even early in the offseason when it wasn't clear if he was going to start even, before he began to rise dramatically late in the process. But I thought he was clearly the most talented back on the team. I absolutely loved his wild running style and 3-down skill set, which made him the RB27 despite missing 4 weeks and playing on an offense that was substantially worse than what he will be part of this year. And then in deeper leagues, where you're just looking to take a couple of swings at the very end of your drafts, rookies Roshan Johnson and Zach Evans going in the mid-50s and 60s respectively. In terms of the position, the two guys I'd like to invest into is part of crowded backfields with the Bears and Rams respectively. Johnson is further in the depth chart to start the season most likely, behind Khalil Herbert and Deontay Foreman, but I believe he has the talent to eventually inch up and end up with 10 to 12 touches a game over the second half of the season. And then in LA, Cam Akers has some underappreciated value himself probably, in a really weird situation where the coaching staff seems to have fallen in, out, and then back in love with him. But if he got injured, or the crew wants to see what they have in the 6th round pick, to me Evans was one of the most underrated backs in the draft and has the skill set to be an effective ball carrier, in particular if we see Sean McVay continue to transition to more gap scheme stuff. That has us moving on to the wide receiver position, and the first name here, out of sight, out of mind, new Jaguars receiver Calvin Ridley. First and foremost, I just don't believe people realize how freaking good Ridley was when last happy and part of a functioning NFL offense. And I know it's been a while because he only played 5 games in 2021 before stepping away from football due to his mental health, and then was suspended all of last season for violating the league's gambling policy during his time off. But if you go back to 2020, he caught 90 passes for nearly 1,400 yards and 9 touchdowns across 15 games. With Julio Jones being in and out of the lineup that year for the Falcons, Ridley actually stepped up as the number 1 option and delivered in so many spots for an Atlanta team that otherwise had very little going for it. He finished as a wide receiver 4 in half-PPR that year and turned himself into one of the toughest covers due to his pristine route running. In fact, his 2.7 yards per route run ranked 3rd league-wide, so he wasn't just a product of getting a bunch of opportunities, yet he was able to make those counts once he got them. I was big on Christian Kirk last year and told you in the same video format to draft him because I saw the opportunity to be a top target in a much more well-coached offense and that we should follow the money there. That worked out, and so did taking Evan Ingram at the end of drafts, which I also told you by the way. That being said, Ridley is substantially better than both those guys, and I think there's a great balance between having the surrounding weapons to keep defenses from bracketing or just giving extra attention to Ridley, but at the same time, him being clearly the best of the bunch and being able to get open regularly as the primary read. Along with finishing last season 7th in total pass attempts, Trevor Lawrence had 55 completions of 20 plus yards, which was the 3rd most in the NFL, and he was tied for a league low checkdown rate at just 3.4%, so there'll be plenty of chances for his top weapon in the intermediate to deep range. Head coach Doug Peterson and general manager Trent Baalke knew what you could get from this guy, which is why they already traded a couple of draft picks last offseason, even though they knew they would have to wait a full year to take him off the shelf. And he could make this offense even better after they already finished top 10 in yards, points, DVOA, and EPA per play last season. The areas in which Ridley could really elevate them is in the red zone, as he will only finish 20th in red zone touchdown percentage, and on 3rd downs, as Trevor Lawrence was down at 23rd in conversion percentage on 3rd and medium, so 3 to 7 yards short of the sticks. Ridley may not look like what most people imagine in a great red zone receiver, but his ability to win quickly and find room inside the condensed space helped him catch 26 touchdowns through his first 3 years. And unfortunately there are no 3rd down numbers for wide receivers going back to 2020, but 74 of his 90 catches that year resulted in either a 1st down or touchdown. Just listening to him talk about how happy he is being back in the NFL now and his mentality going into 2023 has me very excited because I thought of him much higher than most people, understanding how pure a route runner he is, being able to manipulate defenders one-on-one, and his tremendous football IQ. We've seen several clips of him looking great during training camp. He's got a quarterback capable of delivering the ball to him at any spot on the field, and all the arrows are pointing towards him potentially being a fantasy star this season. I mean, Zay Jones was a top 30 wide receiver in fantasy last year, and Christian Kirk was top 15. Now Ridley is supposed to finish somewhere between those two names? No freaking way. He's currently going as wide receiver 18, 42nd overall. I believe he's on the fringe of being a wide receiver 1 in fantasy, and you get him at a wide receiver 2 price tag as my 27th overall player. Next up, we've got another rookie in Jordan Addison for the Vikings. I had Addison as my wide receiver 3 in this most recent draft class, but I believe he has the clearest path to being very productive right off the bat, thanks to the situation he is in and how pro-ready he is entering the league. While he's not quite as fast or dynamic as some other guys in the class, I really like the fact that after being the Biletnikoff winner for Pitt in 2021, catching passes from Kenny Pickett, with a lot of his production coming as a designated touch guy, he was able to make key plays more as a piece of the offense for USC and help Caleb Williams actually win the Heisman Trophy rather than needing to be featured. And I get why the Devi owners may not go crazy for a 175-pound receiver, running right around 4.5 flat, but I believe after Bijan Robinson and the quarterbacks, he's next up in terms of the Offensive Rookie of the Year rankings, and he's right up there among my favorite number 2 receivers to target in terms of role for his team. There's a difference between looking fast on track and if you actually make defenders look slow on the field when you run routes against them. Addison doesn't lose any time getting up to full speed off the line, and he routinely makes DBs overrun the break point. His ability to make every route look the same during the stem, then give them false information and great separation when he's actually ready to commit should translate fairly quickly. Actually very similar to Calvin Ridley, who I thought was the wide receiver 1 in his class and was highly undervalued that year because he wasn't overly impressive physically and was able to produce thanks to how proficient he was as a route runner. That's how I always found 2 seasons and 25 games across those. Addison averaged just under 100 yards and just over a touchdown per game. He fixed his early drop issues with just 2 all of last season, and while the contested catch rate took a significant hit last season, he was way above average in 2021, showing that ability to adjust on the field and make plays on the ball. At around 2.8 yards per route run each of the past 2 seasons, in 2 different Power 5 conferences, and as part of different offensive systems, I feel very good about his game translating to the pro level either way. Yet, if you consider the Vikings already have the best wide receiver in football in Justin Jefferson, I feel great about this guy being able to take advantage of those isolated situations when coverage is rolled towards the superstar, since his metrics were even better against man, with 200 vacated targets available for the taking and no other wide receiver additions outside of undrafted free agents. There's plenty of opportunity to produce without cutting into the workload of Jefferson. Looking at Adam Thiel's 2022 season, even with the worst marks of his career since 2016, with 6.7 yards per target, just a 22% contested catch rate, and a measly 1.08 yards per route run, which ranked 166th among wide receivers with 20 plus targets, he still somehow ended up finishing as the wide receiver 31 in half-PPR, just being out there for his pass-happy offense with good pace, as he ran the second most routes league-wide to only his teammate JJ. And the year before, he was a top 15 wide receiver in points per game. Minnesota saw a definite shift in play calling philosophy under Kevin O'Connell, finishing third in pass play rate at 64.4%, despite lacking a reliable number 2 up until they traded for tight end TJ Hawkinson. Addison is a definite upgrade over Thielen, and anybody else on the roster really, with KJ Osborne as the only viable target outside of that. So if the rookie receiver just takes on those 107 targets that Thielen left on the table and performs like an average number 2, he easily beats that average draft position. If he's any better, you might have a low-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy, or at least a flex at your hands, and you're getting him in the 8th or 9th round, going currently as the 87th overall player, wide receiver 49. I have him up to as wide receiver 27 and 64th overall. And finally, I believe the Texans' Nico Collins is somebody who casual NFL fans don't really actually know and don't fully understand the role he will be in this season. New offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick will be a first-time play caller this season after the D'Amico Ryans brought him along from San Francisco, and having a rookie quarterback always comes within questions. However, just looking at Nico's time in the NFL so far, 927 yards and 3 touchdowns across his first 2 years may not stand out a whole lot, but I think not a lot of people would know that he averaged 48 yards per game last season when he still had Brandon Cooks along with him in the lineup and was catching passes from David Mills and his 6.5 yards per attempt, along with some Kyle Allen and Jeff Driscoll sprinkled in. Play calling, quarterback play, target share, and offensive success overall were all pointing up, and I could see Collins in store for a pretty big season. Going through the next gen database, Collins was basically right in line with Devontae Adams and Stephon Diggs, arguably the 2 top route runners in the league, averaging 2.9 yards of separation, and in terms of his average depth of target at 11.9 yards, and with 8 catches of 20 plus yards in each of his first 2 seasons across 70 total, he's been able to produce down the field quite a bit in relation to opportunities that he's received. Meanwhile, he also only dropped 1 pass in each of those years so far. This guy is 6'4", 215 pounds, with 4.43 speed, much better initial quickness off the line than you'd expect for his size. Yet if he needs to release against the leverage of his defender, he can throw the guy out of the way, has phenomenal body control down the field to lean into and box out guys, and what's underrated about him is how efficient he is with instantly getting up the field once the catch is secured. So understanding that he's going to be the designated X receiver in Slowick's offense, you have to love how well he projects for that. Not only has he been lined up there quite a bit already, but in Kyle Shanahan's offense, that position is the primary read on the majority of dropbacks and is regularly set up for run after catch opportunities. Meanwhile, with quarterback CJ Stroud, coming in with the second overall pick out of Ohio State, you feel pretty good about the fact that he ran quite a few West Coast staples already, even if fundamentally it was much more of a spread out approach, but he also gives you much more in terms of dropping balls into the bucket down the field than most quarterbacks typically operating in those types of offensive systems. To take advantage of Collins in more of a vertical sense, he was the most pro-ready passer in the class. On top of all that, the Texans have 99 more vacated targets than any other team in the league and a massive 357 total. And they do have several more options this season, signing free agent Robert Woods, drafting Houston's Tank Dell early in the 3rd round, and another top 50 pick from last year in John Mechie III, thankfully getting back onto the football field after beating leukemia. So there may be a more fierce competition overall for targets, but none of those guys are suited for the role I expect Nico to assume. Really the only guy in a similar mold on the roster is actually a 6th rounder I like quite a bit in Xavier Hutchinson, but they already have a guy they invested a top 100 pick in and played 71% of offensive snaps unavailable in Collins. If he's just part of your flex rotation, that's a win based on ADP, and I think he could be somebody who delivers 8 to 12 points per game to make you not upset on Monday like some other big play receivers who didn't get you that one long touchdown you were hoping for. He's going as wide receiver 53, 122nd overall. I have him as wide receiver 38 and just inside my top 100. And 3 quick honorable mentions. George Pickens for the Steelers, currently going as wide receiver 36, broken down extensively as a breakout candidate for the season, which you can check out over at Footballtalk.com if you like. Looking at how much he exceeded his expected catch rate with acrobatic grabs, his physicality, and now entering year 2 together with his quarterback Kenny Pickett. He may not be the route runner Deontay Johnson's teammate is, but he gives him more big play upside. Terrace Marshall all the way down as wide receiver 89. Another guy I talked about in that article I just referenced, now entering year 3 with the Panthers, who have been one of the worst offenses in the league, but all his metrics show that he's already made major improvements, and now has a real offensive coaching staff and quarterback around him, with no definite number 1 established in Carolina yet, and Khalil Shakir even a little bit further down as wide receiver 92, who I expect to take over for Isaiah McKenzie in the slot for Buffalo in the 11 personnel sets. Really crafty guy who had some nice flashes in the latter parts of his rookie season in terms of making tough grabs and that extra gear with the ball in his hands. Let's not get to the tight ends, however, and the first name up here, feel free to turn off the video if you have PTSD from hearing this a year ago, but give me Kyle Pitts. This is much less about seeing a name way too low among his position group, rather than just believing in a player that most people are afraid of or just don't want to invest in again after fantasy managers got burned by him last season. Pitts was the tight end 3 or 4, depending on format, who you needed to target early, somewhere in the 4th round of your draft a year ago. He repaid those people with just 28 catches for 356 yards and 2 touchdowns before getting hurt 10 games into the season, and the majority of the production came in 2 games, with 3 or less catches and less than 30 yards in all but 3 of those 10 contests. So why the hell am I telling you to draft this guy? Well, just on the surface, this is a 22-year-old unicorn at the position who is 6'6", just under 250 pounds, runs in the mid 4.4s, and has an 83.5-inch wingspan. And to me, what's most exciting is actually how well he can reduce that frame and be crisp out of his breaks for that size. However, this is not just some uber athletic project. He dominated the SEC in his final season with Florida, and then became just the 2nd tight end in NFL history to go over 1,000 receiving yards as a rookie. He just only reached the end zone once, to put him at tight end 7 that year. Had he gotten an average amount of just 5, let's say, he would have already jumped up to number 3 at the position, behind only Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce that year. I don't believe that should be a major concern, because obviously if you have the length to reach over any defender, his body control and hands, he has the tools to be a monster in the red zone. However, let's for now look at most of what he did as part of an every down offense last season. And I put out an extremely detailed video on the Falcons offense for 2023 like 4 weeks ago, my most successful project yet, so I'd highly encourage you to check it out, not only for fantasy purposes, but also just to become a smarter football fan. Either way, to summarize my thoughts on why Pitts did as poor as he did last season, Atlanta was the only team to run it more than they threw it at 51% of plays. They were still developing the drop-back pass game, while off-play action, Pitts too often was sort of wasted as the threat in the flats. But most importantly, Marcus Mariota could not take advantage of this guy's talent, in particular down the field, where he didn't read leverage correctly and the ball placement was generally off. I still believe they'll run the offense a lot through the ground game, especially off a special talent in 8th overall pick Bijan Robinson toting the rock, and Desmond Ridder is fairly improved at this point. However, I saw Arthur Smith open things up and create favorable passing looks for his young quarterback on early downs, over the latter 2 or 4 starts, and with himself showing promising signs from within structure and the way he would keep his eyes up on the move rather than Mariota quickly turning into a runner. The opportunities are certainly a bit more limited than what they would be on a team with an elite quarterback where they throw the ball in 60+% of plays, but the narrative around the head coach in Atlanta not wanting to feature a dynamic weapon is just flat out wrong. Pitts was targeted on 28.5% of his routes that he ran, and that number actually slightly went up when another top 10 draft pick at pass catcher Drake London was on the field at the same time. Yet with his average depth of target going up by a full 3 yards to 13.8 yards per, the rate of uncatchable targets thrown his way went all the way up to 29%, the highest mark in the league among all guys who ran 200 plus routes last season. Even with all of that in mind, there were some flashes of the tremendous talent that this guy has, where he's elevating for back shoulder fades that look indefensible if placed correctly, catching the slant over the middle, where the safety is looking to decapitate him, yet the defender is actually the one staying down after the play, or crossing up guys in the open field with the ball in his hands. Really what it comes down to is you're drafting either wide receiver 1 or 1A for an offense that may be more run-centric, but wants to hit big plays through the air, and has insane alignment versatility, to where it's hard to bracket or just communicate accordingly how they will defend such a unique weapon. If Arthur Smith is conscious about creating more favorable looks for his young signal call on first down, and takes full advantage of the formational flexibility they present, I could absolutely see Pitts finish behind only Travis Kelce among tight ends. His opportunity is actually better than last year, but you can grab him a good 3 rounds later. He's currently going as tight end 5, but 78th overall. I have him up there as tight end 3 and 39th overall. And then we've got another young guy, and Greg Dulcich for the Broncos. This is one where I'll come back to a lot of the numbers that I mentioned in my write-up on Dulcich as a breakout candidate for 2023, which once again you can check out over at helloswithfootballtalk.com. But let me quickly make my case here for him. For anybody completely unfamiliar with the man sporting the most glorious mustache in the NFL, Dulcich was an early third-round pick for Denver last year, who started the year on IR, but across 10 games played, he hauled in 33 of 55 targets for 411 yards and 2 touchdowns, for a top 10 mark at the position in yards per grab at 12.5 yards per. Being part of an offense that scored a league low in points, he didn't get much of a chance to stand out to people on a national scale, but anybody who's watched this young man play understands that he offers a dynamic skill set for a tight end. Now with Sean Payton coming in and a full offseason to immerse himself into the offense, I believe we could easily see him double those rookie numbers and be much more impactful. To put what Dulcich did as a rookie into context, the only other tight ends who were targeted at least double-digit times with a high average depth of target were Darren Waller and Kyle Pitts, who we just talked about, despite of how boxed in this offense felt like otherwise for the Broncos. And what makes this so impressive is this nugget. The only 2 tight ends with double-digit yards of ADOT and at least 3 yards of separation on average were Mark Andrews and Dulcich, who actually averaged 0.4 yards more separation than the Ravens standard on average, according to next-gen stats. His ability to stress defenses down the seams could change how coverage is structured against him, yet he also features a quick turn to take advantage of hook defenders dropping too deep. His speed can be used on a horizontal plane, and is capable of shaking guys at the top of deeper routes, to where they sent him on a couple of corner post routes last season, with the safety and 2-high looks getting turned the wrong way by him. The most important piece in producing fantasy value is being on the field. When available, that former coaching staff trusted him with playing 75% of the offensive snaps at a position that is generally considered to be very difficult to adapt to, coming from the college level. And Dulcich has never been a great blocker, but he does bring good effort, and his guy rarely makes the tackle. And while I don't want to throw out lofty goals or a name that once was considered one of the premier offensive weapons in football, but just understanding how Sean Payton utilized him, and the fact that he surprisingly came out of retirement recently, there's a reason to believe Dulcich could be used in similar ways as Jimmy Graham did. He's obviously not as big or imposing in contested situations, but he doesn't mind high-powering balls over the middle of the field, and has legit speed to create separation vertically when isolated. As I mentioned earlier with Samaje Perine, we don't know exactly what this offense looks like for Denver, and how Payton intends to reinvigorate quarterback Russell Wilson, but even last season when the passing attack faced several hiccups, they found ways to feature this guy, and went to him quite a bit of third downs already. Dulcich is currently going at the fringe of being a tight end 1 in 12-team leagues, which I believe he absolutely is, and has the skill sets to be among the upper half of that group, because Payton has highlighted a big slot receiver for the majority of his time in New Orleans. So even if you think of Dulcich as more of your Marcus Colston-esque player, even though the de facto tight end is actually faster, That's a guy who went for over 900 receiving yards and 5+ touchdowns in every year he played at least 12 games. Once again, feel free to check out my written piece on him for further detail. But going as tight end 12, 133rd overall, I have him up there as tight end 10 and 80th overall. Some honorable mentions here: Hayden Hurst for the Panthers, currently going as tight end 26, kind of becoming an annual tradition at this point. A much better player than being on his 4th team in as many years would suggest, as somebody I'd label as an average to slightly below average starter, but the most effective pass catching tight end on the Panthers offense that will look very different under the new regime. And first overall pick Bryce Young utilized a similar player at that spot quite a bit on key downs and in the red zone at Alabama. Lions rookie Sam Laporta, who has now risen to tight end 23, but still undrafted in most leagues. Loved the ability to get open and create offense after the catch at Iowa, used in a very multifaceted way, and provides great effort for Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson to fall in love with, which is why they selected him over a couple of more highly regarded names in the draft. And while we all have high expectations for that attack yet again, the amount of proven pass catchers in Detroit is less than it's made out to be. And then Cade Otton as a really deep sleeper for the Bucs, being your current tight end 32, entering year 2 now with the Bucs, an offense nobody wants to really invest into, but this isn't a player you actually have to use a draft pick on, but just as somebody to pay attention to as a waiver wire option. Very complete skill set to keep him on the field, and had nearly 400 receiving yards from week 4 onwards, plus now there's no Cameron Brate to worry about, so he has some upside here. Now let's wrap things up with the defenses/special teams. I'm not going to talk about any kickers here, but just wanted to quickly mention 3 units here. First up, the Miami Dolphins, going as a defense 12 right now. They fell off in a major way last season, in parts due to missing a reliable number 2 corner, and one of the starting safeties being hurt for half the year. But more importantly, the firing of Brian Flores as the head coach under dubious circumstances, which left defensive coordinator Josh Boyer by himself. And we saw opposing quarterbacks and play callers being able to dissect that scheme, which became very predictable, and they couldn't counter the answers the offense had found for punishing the pressure packages. After finishing 4th and 3rd respectively the prior 2 seasons in terms of fantasy points, they were just tied for 18th league-wide. This year, I believe they'll be a lot more structurally sound, and Vic Fangio now, one of the main architects of the modern split safety defenses, but certainly not as easy to decipher as many of the offsprings we've seen who just sit back in zone and allow opponents to pick them apart. The ability to change the picture post-snap and force quarterbacks to hold onto the ball should allow his pass rush to get home regularly. Now that Bradley Chubb is there for full off-season, Jalen Phillips turned himself into a game wrecker with the latter parts of 2022, and Christian Wilkins will have opportunity to attack up the field much more regularly. You add David Long Jr. to the second level, who was a key component in Tennessee, being the number 1 defense in success rate and EPA versus the run last season, despite showing the second lightest boxes across the league. Jalen Ramsey, or the collection of guys they were trying outside last year, would have been a massive upgrade, and they could have moved him into the slot for certain matchups and downs. But now with him probably being out until late November, they did draft Cam Smith out of South Carolina in the 2nd round, who has inside-out versatility himself, and that injury alone has given us a discount now for this defense, as Miami has dropped a couple of spots in positional rankings since I first collected the data. And if they hit the way I think they could, you get Ramsey back for the playoff run in real life and in fantasy. I don't think Vic ever had the full defensive talent for the Broncos available to him during his time as head coach there, but his final season as defensive coordinator in Chicago, they were the number 1 overall and fantasy defense in the league. So this Miami defense could absolutely be one that is a plus unit for 2023, rather than being one that barely gets started in your leagues. Then the Cleveland Browns, currently going as defense 16. Similar to Miami, I believe Cleveland is judged way too much based on what they were in 2022, rather than looking at the depth chart and projecting what they could be this season. They finished dead last in rush EPA, outside the top 20 takeaways, and tied for 27th sacks, despite having arguably the premier pass rusher in football in Myles Garrett. And yet they were tied for 18th with the Dolphins for fantasy purposes. So just based on that, all they need to do is improve by a couple of spots to live up to the ADP, but I believe they have room to rise a lot higher. Everything that went wrong for this group last year had to do with the fact they could not win the line of scrimmage and consistently allow opponents to stay ahead of the chains by running right at them. They did not have a real nose tackle on the roster. That's why they made Dalvin Tomlinson the big free agency addition and spent a draft pick just inside the top 100 on Baylor's massive Siaki Ika to back him up. That'll allow somebody like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, who led the NFL in run stop percentage last season, to run around freely and create negative plays. Juan Thornhill replaces John Johnson at safety, who is much more of a playmaker to provide turnovers, along with having the range to play single high when he wants to man up with what might be the top 3 of corners in the league. And they addressed that edge position across from Myles Garrett from multiple avenues, signing Obo Okoronkwo as a true speedballer at the corner, drafting Isaiah McGuire as more of a power-based player in the middle rounds, and then snatching up Zadarius Smith once he became available as somebody with the ability to move along the front and attack from multiple angles. Hopefully stopping the run at a higher rate will get them more opportunities in obvious passing situations, setting the table for the rush to get home, and balls being thrown up for grabs. This unit may go undrafted, and if I end up in a situation where receiver or back I'm still not sure about leading up to week 1 is available, I may punt on defense initially, and then just pick up these Browns the day of the season opener. And finally, the Carolina Panthers, another one to pay attention to in the deeper leagues, currently going as defense 22. They've been a much better unit than the final rankings or general consensus would suggest. The offense has just been so bad that the dam broke at some point, and NFL coaches started figuring out ways of how to defeat the scheme and pressure packages that former defensive coordinator Phil Snow tried to apply. The 17 takeaways and 35 sacks last season put them at 27th and tied for 25th across the league respectively, which are the 2 main ways to add points after you take off whatever in accordance to how many points the opposing team scored. However, even then, they were the number 9 defense in fantasy, tied with what was perceived as one of the elite units in the Jets for the entirety of last season. Personnel-wise, they're bringing back pretty much every meaningful contributor, with emerging young players at all 3 levels, including JC Horn looking like a shutdown type of corner, shockingly quickly after tearing his Achilles early on as a rookie. Yet he also added Shai Tuttle from the division rivals in the Saints to firm out the interior D-line, and added one of the most underrated safeties in the league in Von Bell, who was a super versatile piece in the Bengals' success the last couple of years. More importantly, they bring in one of the bright young defensive minds in the league in Ejiro Evero to run the show, who is much closer to the NFL meta in terms of general approach on the back end, but is able to keep opposing teams guessing with disguising coverages and giving the pass rush more time to shine. As the 22nd ranked defense right now, I'm not advising you to actually waste a final draft pick on this selection, but if you're desperate for a change at that spot, or just need a unit to fill in for a couple of weeks maybe, looking at Carolina facing Baker Mayfield / Kyle Trask twice this year, and potentially 3 rookie quarterbacks in the AFC South, they're worth considering. That'll do it for this year's Fantasy Diamonds. Here's a quick look at all the names I just talked about. Quarterbacks Justin Herbert and Anthony Richardson, running backs David Montgomery, Samaje Perine and Jerome Ford, wide receivers Calvin Ridley, Jordan Addison, Nico Collins, the 2 tight ends Kyle Pitts and Greg Dulcich, and in terms of defenses, the Dolphins, Browns and Panthers. Of course, these are just some of the players or units I like better than the ADP suggests. I've got my complete half-PPR rankings done, although I may still tinker with the late names a little bit. I'm happy to answer any further questions in the comments, and you can hit me up on social media if you'd like to have my Excel sheets. If you just send me $5 or $10 on PayPal, I can definitely forward them to you. Best of luck this season for all long-term players and first-time owners, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so yet, as well as maybe share this with a couple of friends, preferably who you're not in the league with. As for my content leading up to the season, I posted my personal NFL Top 100 list last week to stir up the pot a little bit, but trying to do it with an objective view on the league rather than what the list looks like typically. I've got one more video coming out next week on the most pivotal situations across the league, where I'll talk about certain players or units who present some volatility and how they could affect this upcoming year. After that, I've got my written piece where I predict the entire 2023 NFL season, and then it's already time to kick off. Crazy how quickly we got back here, but damn am I happy to have football back. Feel free to check out all my other content up to this point to get yourself ready to go, with the link to my page hello@footballtalk.com down below in the video description, and check out my social media handles, which are there as well, where I'll provide my thoughts on stuff happening around the league, more fantasy and betting advice. So until then, see you later. Peace!